A brief introduction. My name is Manjuvajra. I currently live at Uttara, which is an annex of Guhyaloka out in Spain. Before that, I lived on a narrowboat for 3 years, wandering the waterways of England, which was great, really enjoyed that. And before that, I was looking after my father for 7 years as he had Alzheimer's. Before that, I was living at Guhyaloka for about 6 years. And before that, I was living at Padmaloka for several years as well. Before that, I was in the States for 17 years. With Vajradhaka and Punya, we established the movement in the States in 1980. Before that, I was at the LBC helping construct that wonderful building. Hated every minute of it. Before that, I was in Cornwall, where I established a small group. Loved every minute of it. And before that, I was in London, confused and battered. That brings us back to 1970, which was 50 years ago, which was when I first met Bhante, almost to the day, actually. I met him in early April 1970. So it's kind of sobering to think back that I've known him and some of my closest friends for that long. It was a very important first meeting. For a few years before that, I'd had some experiences. Some of them were chemically induced, some of them were not. But I'd had some experiences that I referred to as it. And I knew that it was important. I knew that I somehow wanted to base my life around it, but I had no idea what it was. I couldn't express it. I didn't know what to do with it. So I was looking around in London at various spiritual groups, various spiritual teachers, Hindu, mystical things. Nothing really seemed to click. And then I met Bhante. And within a couple of days, this happens, within a couple of days of meeting him, I knew that this guy knew about it. Yeah, he knew what it was. Not only did he know what it was, but he'd linked it to the great Buddhist tradition. And that happened literally within the first couple of days. He was also presenting methods by which one could develop one's connection with it. And there were other people around him who were also pursuing it. So I found my home. I went for a weekend to that first retreat and then liked it so much, went back with my then wife, Dhammadina, to the latter end of the retreat as well. By the end of that retreat, I think I was firmly linked to Bhante as my teacher. Not that I was particularly attracted to him. I didn't find him a particularly attractive personality or anything. But what he was saying it linked in with this very deep part of myself. And that was the essential nature of our relationship. And that's as it remained, all the way to today. I mean, I'm not even going to say till he died, because it continues. That relationship continues. And the essence of that relationship is it. This sort of mysterious it, which was becoming the centre of my life. I am deeply grateful to Bhante for that connection, because without it, I would have lost it, I'm sure. Sorry, this always happens when I do this. I really am very, very deeply grateful to him, because he gave me my life. He gave me the last 50 years, which I've, in the main, really enjoyed and really valued. So I do experience a lot of gratitude towards him. And I realised on the last retreat I was on that gratitude is towards Bhante, certainly, but it's also a non-directed gratitude. At times when I'm in contact with it, I'll say more about it in a minute, when I'm in contact with it, I feel a kind of just gratitude. Not to anyone. If I believed in God, it would be gratitude to God. It's just this sort of sense of I've been given something which is so utterly valuable that I feel grateful to whatever. that idea of a non-directed experience is something I'm going to come back to a little bit in a minute, because I think it sort of indicates a certain other dimension to what might otherwise be quite ordinary experiences. So the nature of what we shared, what was it that Bhante was talking about? It was Vision and Transformation, was the series of talks we were listening to, on tape actually. You know, probably some of you don't know about them. They used to be on reels and they used to go round and break. So what it was insight, you know, what we now know as insight. It was unclear, it was confused, and it was partial, but it was a vision of something beyond anything else, just a glimpse of it. Now this is the basis of our spiritual life. This is the basis of our Buddhist life. Everything else that we do really is based on that foundation. This insight, to whatever degree, to whatever intensity we feel it, that is the core of our spiritual life. The rest of the spiritual life is the unfolding of it, the transformation of our existence in accordance with that connection. Now that insight comes in many forms and can be interpreted in many ways. You know, my highly kind of intellectual understanding of it in the beginning was it's it. Yeah, not very deep, not very profound, not very descriptive. But the Buddhist tradition, of course, provides many different ways of trying. You can't describe it, of course, but of trying to connect with that insight experience. The main ways are, of course, the cognitive, understanding the nature of reality, recognizing praticca samutpada, recognizing that all things arise in dependence upon conditions, recognizing that there's nothing that exists in and of its own right. So it's the lakshanas, it's understanding the lakshanas, seeing the lakshanas as actually operating in existence. It's recognizing the insubstantiality of the self, the impermanence of the self. Incidentally, there's in one of the songs of Milarepa's teaching the young shepherd boy to see through his self, which he does successfully. Milarepa then says to him, well, now you've seen through the self, there's another job to be done, and that is to see the empty nature of all dharmas. In order to do that, you need to go to the mountains and meditate for 12 years. Yeah? So I think that's an interesting little snippet of a story, isn't it? It's saying that seeing the emptiness of self, seeing no self in a way, is not the end of the story. It's in a way, it's just the beginning of those 12 years to be spent in the mountains, contemplating the development of that experience. But insight can also be experienced in different ways. It can be experienced by overwhelming emotion, just a really intense feeling of love and compassion, the kind of love and compassion that can't be explained and is not directed towards any particular person, but just is love, compassion. That kind of experience is also another way in which we can experience it. Another way is through faith, through confidence. I think this is what this really means is that one has an experience of something which is real. You can't exactly define it, but you know you've had your feet on the ground of something which is real, even though that ground is not a ground. So it can just be that kind of confidence. Confidence non-directed, confidence not in anything in particular, but just deep confidence that one has had this kind of connection with reality. So there are these various ways. I'll touch on these again a bit later on. Cognitive experience, emotional experience. I mean, this is the stuff of a lot of mystics, isn't it? Just sort of intense love, intense compassion. That is their kind of entry into insight. And then faith, confidence. So all of these, one thing that all of these have in common, as the Buddha tells us, is that they all have the taste of freedom. So that is a kind of a touch point for them. They've got that taste of freedom. So it's freedom that I want to sort of talk about today. Another, as well as the Buddha mentioning the taste of freedom in, can't remember where it is now, it's in the Udana, isn't it? There are many cases where the Buddha is taught, as communicated to a person or group of persons. And they say these various things, don't they? They say, Lord, it's as if a great burden was put down. Or it's as if one were freed from jail. Or it's as if one were freed from a great debt. So all of these are descriptions of freedom. Different kinds of ways of expressing this sense of liberation, of freedom that comes when one sees the truth, experiences infinite love, and so on. But let's have a look at it a bit more closely. What is it freedom from? Freedom, of course, means casting off bondage, casting off fetters. Freedom means letting go of this or that. So freedom comes from renunciation, from letting go. In fact, they're two sides of the same coin. You can't be free without letting go. This is why I've titled this talk, The Door of Liberation, because renunciation is the door that you have to go through into the vast expanse of freedom. You have to give up something, you have to give up things, and you have to give up a lot of things in order to experience ultimate liberation. So the Buddha talks of the 5 lower fetters, which bind us to the Kamaloka. It's quite interesting that these are mentioned in the Pali Canon many times. But the 5 higher fetters are not mentioned too often, just a few times. And so obviously what the Buddha is much more concerned with is the fetters that bind us to the Kamaloka. And being free from the first 5 fetters means that we're free from the Kamaloka, the realm of the senses. The 5 higher fetters are those that bind us, first of all, to the Rupaloka, the 6th, 7th to the Arupaloka, and the 8th and beyond to the all-important, deep-seated sense of a permanent self. So, let's look at these 3 lokas in turn. First of all, renunciation of the Kamaloka. What does that mean? And obviously I'm going to have a bit more to say about this than about the other 2, which are not so much of an immediate everyday concern. The Kamaloka means particularly craving and hatred with respect to the world of the senses. So what we're talking about here is abandoning, renouncing the world of the senses. It's a pretty big world, isn't it? It's the objective pole of our normal experience, of our normal everyday experience. Quite often when people discover I'm an anagarika, we might be out walking, well, people know I'm an anagarika, we're out walking in the street, for example, and I see a pretty girl, and I watch the pretty girl. They say, thought you were an anagarika. Oh. Yeah, not meant to look at pretty girls, or pretty boys if I was that way inclined. Or if I'm drinking coffee, didn't think anagarikas drank coffee. So there is this rather sort of superficial view of what renunciation is. You don't chuck your body in the bin when you renounce things. You don't chuck your ordinary human responses in the bin. What you do is you just don't necessarily act on them. You don't act unskillfully on them. So I can see a pretty girl, I can really enjoy it, and pretty girl's gone. That's it, that's fine. That superficial approach to renunciation, I think, is what, in a way, gives it a bit of a bad name. So I'm going to talk about renunciation in a rather more, it's in a much more general much more general terms. Anyway, I mentioned the pretty girl, pretty boy, whatever. And the paradigm of renunciation, of attachment, of course, is sexual attraction. In fact, the Buddha says, when talking about renunciation, he says, cut down the whole forest. It's not very ecological. Cut down the whole forest, not just one tree. From the forest of attachment, craving, arises fear. Cutting down both wood and brushwood, be out of the wood, almsman. For as long as the brushwood of passions of man for woman, for example, I comment, is not cut down, so long is his mind in bondage like a suckling calf to its mother cow. Worthy of reflection. Now, of course, we have to make our own modifications to that if that isn't our major kind of passion. I think maybe woman's attachment to child is much more relevant than woman's attachment to men, because as we know, once the child's there, well, the man's sort of not so important anymore. Now, this bond is paradigmatic. It's because we know what it means. We understand the dynamics of it. So it represents a kind of model of all other attachments and all other things that we need to renounce. But it's a bit more than that, because this particular bond initiates many more. The attachment of man to woman, for example, means that you probably move in together at some time or another. Once you set up home together, well, there's always the possibility of a family. Once you've got a family, well, then you must have a career, some kind of work, some sort of steady work. Once you've got steady work, you start to build up wealth of possessions and money. And in that way, you open the whole bag of attachment to worldly things, worldly activity. So it's more than just a symbol, it's also the kind of the doorway to non-liberation, in a way. Nobody's left, good. So let's look at another aspect of attachment to the world of the senses. And this comes from Gampopa. The translators of Dual Liberation say that renouncing the world, according to Gampopa, really means letting go of the busy world of social intercourse in all its manifestations. So renunciation of the world means to renounce the complex web of social interactions and all its traps and distractions, so that we can see beyond that. Now, that is quite a big network of connections that we engage in. Doesn't mean to say we mustn't have any contact with people. It just means that we mustn't be attached to that network, dependent upon that network. Gampopa actually says, give up enjoyment of towns and cities and always turn to retreat in the forests. Be single-minded at all times, like a rhinoceros, and it will not be long before the best profound absorption is attained. And again, the essential characteristic of the world, social busyness, is to be distracted through the company of one's children, spouse, acquaintances or possessions. Attachment to material things such as food, clothing, comfort and so on, and attachment to reputation and respect such as other people's opinions. Because of such attachments, one cannot get away from the world. So those are the sort of things we're also encouraged to work against, going forth from social connection. When I moved to Gigaloka back in the mid-2000s, I was very aware that one of the things I was giving up was status. I mean, before that, I'd lived at Padmaloka. Before that, I'd been in the States. And in both of those places, I had a certain status. You know, I was somebody. People knew me. And, no matter how hard you try, you kind of get to rely on that a bit. You get to rely on having your shape, as it were, supported by the interactions of other people. And I knew that going to Guhyaloka I'd lose some of that, because I would be off there in the mountains. I wouldn't be visible. I wouldn't be engaging with people and so on. And I must say, I think giving up status was actually more difficult than giving up women, which was hard enough. So it was that was quite a surprise to me. Another thing that I personally have experienced is the idea of giving up, like what I've called, perhaps not very well, but social religion. Being part of a religious movement. One maintains connections. So you keep all these connections going because you're part of this religious movement. Now, living at Uttara, where I live a much more kind of hermit-like life, I'm not really having those contacts. I don't have these string of appointments in my diary. I kind of like Vajrabandhu, September to December. It's that kind of, that's my social calendar. So again, I sometimes feel uncomfortable about that. I feel I'm losing connection, losing contact. Actually, I think I built contact with people in the order in another way, but I'm not going to go into that. So, there's the fear of losing hits on one's Facebook page, or likes, isn't it? Likes. So there's the fear of losing one's social position is a very real thing, I think, that holds people back from going away, particularly on long retreats. The internet, I've just mentioned, the internet is wonderful, it's fantastic, I love it, but it's also evil. It also multiplies the ways in which we feel connected to the world so many times. And it's so easy just to become dependent upon that buzz from, Facebook, I don't know the others, but BBC News, Al Jazeera, these are my things, I feel I need to be in contact with the world through these apps. But more than this, letting go of the Kamaloka actually means letting go of the whole world of the senses, the whole experience of the physical senses. The Buddha suggests that to meditate, you should go to the wilderness, to the shade of a tree or an empty building, sit down, fold legs crosswise, hold the body erect, set mindfulness to the fore, withdraw from the senses and enter the first dhyana. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. But actually, even, the first one, going to the wilderness, is pretty difficult. It's pretty hard to leave all of that worldly activity that we've got. Maybe, in a way, your shrine room is your own personal wilderness, perhaps. So you can go there, you can do it. But to do it for extended period of times is actually very difficult. But that's what it means. It means going into meditation and withdrawing entirely from the world of the physical senses. There are subtle senses that develop, I think, once one does that, but we'll deal with those in a minute. So it's withdrawing from the world of the senses, letting go of the world of the senses, letting go of one's connection with them. But this is not all. Remember, the Buddha is encouraging us to break the higher fetters as well. So he's encouraging us to let go, to renounce the rupa loka. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, not by a shower of coins does contentment arise in sensual pleasures. Of little sweetness, but painful are sensual pleasures. Knowing this, the wise man finds no delight even in heavenly pleasures. The disciple of the fully enlightened one delights in the destruction of craving. So that goes a step further. Not only do we delight in removing our, and it is at Uttara, genuinely you can experience a realm that's where you're not engaged with the senses, and it is delightful. You can just sit there enjoying nothing in particular, just enjoying just content. It doesn't need an object. You're just able to do that. But even that, you've got to go beyond. You've got to renounce even that. You've got to let go of that. You can't even hold on to that kind of level of contentment and happiness. We got this wonderful story of Nanda, haven't we, the Buddha's cousin. So Nanda gave up the most beautiful girl in the realm, the most beautiful woman in the realm, for the nymphs, for the heavenly nymphs. By the way, I was reading a commentary on the Sutta Nipata, and there's a description of where these nymphs live, which is really fascinating. If you think the Pali Canon is a bit dry, listen to this. There is a Naga who takes the form of an elephant. This elephant has 32 tusks. On each of these 32 tusks, there are 7 lotus ponds. On each of these lotus ponds, there are 7 lotuses. On each of these lotuses, there are 7 beautiful nymphs. Those are the nymphs that Nanda saw. So if you can ignore the bizarreness of the elephant and everything, there's a whole load of beautiful nymphs there. So this is the kind of order we're talking about. You know, what do you want? One ordinary beautiful human, or scores of lotus-standing, elephant-wielding nymphs? you know, it's a no-brainer. But what did Nanda do then? He left the nymphs for the delight of liberation. He moved on from that to the delight of liberation. So he moved on from the Rupa Loka. We don't hear anything about the Arupa Loka in this particular case, but he moved on into liberation. Taking refuge in the heaven realms, of course, can be seen in different ways. I think it's taking refuge in the kind of the whole imaginative realm that meditation opens up, which is very rich, very exciting, very engaging. And one can just sort of, in a way, think, well, this is it. This is all I want to do. I just want to kind of live with these devas and dakinis and so on, and live in that realm. But that is not enough. I think it also refers to reliance on God. I mean, you may meet God in your meditation. I did once go to his throne room and was very surprised to see he wasn't there. There was hundreds of angels playing trumpets and things, but no God. It's quite a surprise. Anyway, but belief in God, I think, would come under this category. You know, reliance on God, the belief that there is an objective God would be one of the things that one would have to renounce in order to be fully liberated, obviously. So we have to let go. Milarepa, of course, specifically warns against getting stuck in the Rupa Loka and the Arupa Loka. The last song of the Shepherd's Search for Mind, he specifically mentions these two states and says that what you should do is live in dhyana, yes, but always go for refuge to the Buddha and develop compassion for all beings. So that is straightforward Milarepa teaching. So we let go of the bliss of contentment in meditation. Not that we dump it completely. It doesn't mean to say we avoid these experiences. Very far from it. I mean, we're encouraged to experience them, but we hold loosely to them. You know, when you leave meditation, you leave meditation. You come back to the world of the senses. You deal with that on that level. But then, when you've got the opportunity, you go into meditation, you withdraw from the senses, you go into these higher realms. But even giving up the Rupa Loka is not enough. We've got to also renounce, according to the 7th fetter, we've also got to renounce the Arupa Loka. The Arupa Loka, of course, is the experience of the infinite, of the eternal. It's the experience of the self dissolving into the non-self on a temporary basis. So that also, if it happens, it can be something that we can really kind of grab hold of and think, well, this is it. You know, I've done this. This is as far as I can go. But it's not. There is one also has to let go of the arupa loka, and in a way just come back to the kama loka. So in other words, we live within the whole realm of the wheel of life, including the higher realms of the gods and of infinite space and so on. But we live in it loosely. We allow ourselves to move around it loosely rather than rigidly. That's what renunciation means. It doesn't mean that you completely dump something. It means that you live loosely with it. So let's have a look at a few places where we see renunciation in action. Of course, initially the Buddha, the life of the Buddha. The going forth of the Buddha from home is him renouncing social busyness, renouncing family, home, wealth, all of those worldly things. He goes forth because he's inspired by seeing someone who had done that. There's that positive element there, drawing him forward. So he goes forth in that way, goes forth from the Kamaloka. He meets his first and second teachers, meditation teachers, who show him the higher realms, the realms of the Rupa Loka and the realms of the Arupa Loka. But he realizes that that's not enough. There's something incomplete about that. So he renounces those. He says, no, this isn't where it's at. He finally sits under the Bodhi tree and is liberated from the root cause of all of these bonds, which is the conception of or the experience of a permanently existing self. Seeing the nature of reality, seeing conditioned co-production, seeing the lakshanas, seeing the Noble Eightfold Path, seeing the truth of vision and then transformation, and so on. And finally, and this is one we don't always talk about, he was still attached to the life force until he met Mara at the Kapala shrine shortly before he passed into parinirvana. So there was still something of him there was still something that he was attached to. He was still attached to the life force, the kind of, I suppose, the desire to continue, the desire for life. But he agreed with Mara at that point to abandon even that. And after that, he was into parinirvana, complete and final nirvana. So in the Buddha, we see this kind of life of renunciation of all of these different elements. Milarepa, in fact, I knew Milarepa before the Buddha. So he was always been quite a strong influence on me. Milarepa is probably the epitome. He's the ideal of the practice of renunciation. His life story doesn't hide any of the difficulties that he experienced, but he's an inspiration of an example of the joys of renunciation. You know, his is, he had a tough time, but he expresses joy. He always expresses joy. All of his songs are directed towards people of all different lifestyles, encouraging them, both householders and yogis, to abandon the lesser pleasures of the world for the infinitely greater pleasures of spiritual freedom. Milarepa lives with the Dakinis. We'll hear more about them in a minute. He's an uncompromising in his advocacy of renunciation. But it is always joyful. The reading we had last night, he says, because I've left my kinsmen, I am happy. Because I have abandoned attachment to my country, I'm happy. Since I disregard this place, I'm happy. Because I do not wear the lofty garb of priesthood, I am happy. Because I cling not to house and family, I am happy. I need not this or that, so I am happy. I possess the great wealth of Dharma, so I am happy. And so on, as we heard last night for several pages. Tsongkhapa famously says, aim your mind to practice. Aim your practice to the beggar. Aim the beggar to death. Aim death ultimately to a dusty ravine. In other words, drop it all without hope. You know, even attachment to hope is an attachment. So drop it all and then see what happens. We have these beautiful Chinese, Japanese and Korean traditions of mountain hermits describing the simplicity of their lives in the mountains. They've renounced the world. They're living very simple lives, chopping wood, chopping wood, carrying water. And that simplicity really is the sort of the practice that we can engage in. Mr. Chen has said to Bhante, or is one of Bhante's teachers, and he said this: the first mistake is not having a foundation of renunciation as a firm base for the practice of meditation. Quite often I receive correspondence from America, and my lay Buddhist friends there say that to renounce is easy for people in the East, but very hard for Westerners. They complain that in the West there are so many things to give up, it is made so difficult. To them I reply that the right thing to do is to lay even more stress on renunciation. If someone finds mathematics difficult to study, the only way he can learn to progress in the subject is to make even greater efforts. So it is with renunciation. If we find it difficult, we should struggle and put forth great efforts in order to overcome our attachments and enable us to give them up completely. Renunciation is clearly a central practice in the Buddhist tradition, but it's not in the forefront of most Buddhists' mind. There's a statistic that I love to quote about a Korean Buddhist organisation. It has 11 million members, right? 11 million paid-up members. Of those, 8,000 live in monasteries, monks and nuns. Of those, about 600 are what you would call full-time meditators. Now this, I think, gives us a kind of an idea of what we might expect in perhaps any Buddhist movement. Not everybody's going to really want to renounce. Not everybody's going to want to renounce to the extent of, living in a mountain hut and really focusing on meditation. But there will be some. And I think we as a movement need to make space, make place for those people. I think it's unappreciated in the West, partly because we've got this Christian perspective of self-denial, which is entirely negative and entirely contrary to Buddhist renunciation, which is to step into freedom. But there's also, I think, there's a perfectly rational fear that if you give up things in which you take great enjoyment, that you might miss them, you might be unhappy. Well, that's true. One may miss them, one may be unhappy for a bit, but the promise is a greater pleasure, and that's what one always has to bear in mind, I think. Now, I'm personally quite inspired by renunciation, as you may have guessed, but I've always enjoyed the worldly life. I'm a bit of a sensualist, actually. I enjoy good food, chocolate, occasional glass of wine, all of those things. I enjoy my possessions. I delight in the things that I've got. I enjoy travel and social life. And I've enjoyed a fairly rich diet of relationships with women. But I've also felt the life of a pull for the life of freedom, a liberation from the pulls of the worlds, even the pulls of the most pleasurable experiences. When I was young, I used to go hitchhiking quite a lot. This is in the 60s. And I remember once on the Newbury bypass, not, the most romantic of places, but I just had a really nice lift and I was dropped from this lift and I felt blissfully happy. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to be. So I jumped up on this wall and started dancing. I must have looked completely crazy, but I was so happy just to have nothing to do, nowhere to go. It was wonderful. Quite often I found in relationships that when the relationship ends, it's usually my partner that's ended it, I must say, I feel a certain grief. But mixed in with that grief, there's always a sense of freedom. Sometimes it's just freedom to get another girlfriend, but I mean, there's always a sense of relief in there, actually, that I'm glad, I'm free, I'm feeling independent. what I decided to do, 20 years ago now, is actually kind of focus on that freedom rather than on the grief, or rather than on the loss. And I've found it's paid off. I've just enjoyed it more and more and more. So I still like women, but I would not give up my freedom. I won't give that up. Another experience I've had is of living a simple life. On a Guhyaloka course in the 2000s, I was just walking back from the loo to my hut one day, and I realised that I didn't want anything. I was perfectly content just being there, and it was blissful. And I realised that it was the not wanting anything that was blissful. It wasn't a kind of the bliss wasn't a consequence of not wanting anything. The bliss was actually the not wanting of anything. So non-attachment itself is blissful. So if one can put oneself into a situation where you're not experiencing desire, then that is blissful in itself. So as I say, not everyone, but a few will embrace this idea of renunciation. Reginald Ray, of course, wrote his famous book, Buddhist Saints in India, where he outlined that any successful Buddhist society has got three groups of followers. There are the lay practitioners who live to all, at least visibly, they live with their families, they have careers and so on and so forth. Then there's the monastics, those that live within sort of communities, but they're still engaged with the world. They're still doing things. I suppose when you think of the old monasteries in the West particularly, they were very engaged with the world, deeply engaged with worldly activities. So maybe not to that extent, but I'm sure Buddhist communities throughout the world are engaged with worldly activities. And then there's the forest renunciants, those that just go away and live in the mountains or in the forest and just get on with their own practice. I think that we've certainly got at least two of those. I think we also really need to have an explicit forest tradition within our own movement. And this is what excites me about Uttaraloka, where I live. I'm thinking these days of that being a kind of a forest hermitage. I live there by myself at the moment, but I welcome any order member, any male order member, to come and join me for any period of time from a week onwards. A week, fortnight, a month, 3 months, a year, 2 years, whatever. To come and sort of just get a really good taste. It really is a forest place. It's miles away from anywhere. Internet reception is really, really bad. I do know a secret place where you can get it, but that would cost you serious money for me to reveal that. You can really get away from the world, and you're not allowed. You don't leave. Once you're there, you stay there till you finally leave. No going off to the village or down to the coast or anything like that. And there's a program, a kind of a skeletal program of activities that you can join in with, and there's plenty of time to follow your own interests. We're also thinking of reforming Guhyaloka in a similar way, so that Guhyaloka will become a forest community with an active, ongoing, sort of good, strong spiritual practice in the community. And we will, of course, always host the ordination course as well. But in the past, I think Guhyaloka has been known as the place where people go for ordination. I now want it to be known as a forest community where we hold the ordinations. Do you see what I mean? So that we can really be proud in a way in our movement that we do actually have a forest community. We do have a forest retreat centre. It's work in progress. I think, the community at Guhyaloka is going to have to change a little. Not much, but a little. It's not going to have to change, actually. It's just going to have to tighten up on what it does. So I think we can see this as a possibility. So you're all invited. Guhyaloka will also be open to Manjuvajra ordination and to friends as well. Male, all men, just men. Okay, I've got a few minutes left. I'll see what else I can cover. So the practice of renunciation. A few comments about practicing it. The first is that it's a gradual process. In the Buddhist tradition, things tend to be talked about in sort of symbolic, mythic terms. So, for example, the Buddha left home one night. Yeah, it was one event. It's all nicely packaged up in that one event. I suspect it wasn't quite like that. I suspect it was part of a process, a much longer process. So it's not necessarily, it isn't that it's necessary, it doesn't happen, I don't think, that one just goes forth. That would be totally impractical. It's a bit like stopping an express train against a brick wall. It would be disastrous. It's a gradual process. We move a little bit at a time. I actually think that the Buddha's enlightenment, although it's described as a once and for all experience under the Bodhi tree, I hope this isn't too unorthodox. I also think that probably it wasn't quite like that either, actually. So I think that it was, he certainly had a very strong experience of insight, which then affected his whole life. But this idea of, you're down here and then all of a sudden you're up here seems to me unlikely. So gradual. It's a gradual process, bit by bit. It's very important to let go of things on the basis of a firm experience of a positive state that one's moving to. Otherwise, it just becomes sort of, self-denial and, painful negative process. One needs to have a taste. One needs to have a vision of what one's moving towards. We've talked about the case of Nanda. There's another section in the Majjhima Nikaya that I'd like to read. The Buddha's talking to Mahanama. He says, "There is still a state unabandoned by you internally, owing to which at times states of greed, hate and delusion invade your mind and remain. For were that state already abandoned by you internally, you would not be living the home life, you would not be enjoying sensual pleasures. It is because that state is unabandoned by you internally that you are living the home life and enjoying sensual pleasures. Even though a noble disciple has seen clearly, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering and much despair, and how great is the danger in them, as long as he does not attain to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, namely liberation, he may still be attracted to sensual pleasures, but when a noble disciple has seen clearly, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering, and much despair, and how great is the danger in them, and he attains to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, then he is no longer attracted to sensual pleasures." He even says that this was exactly his own experience. He could only practice renunciation on the experience of even more pleasurable states of contentment, insight, and so on. So the Buddha stresses that we let go of our worldly pleasures only for greater pleasures, the rapture and pleasures of dhyana, or something more peaceful than that, i.e. the great bliss of insight and liberation. Where does one find these positive mental states? In one's own mind. They're there. All you have to do is quieten the mind down sufficiently. Go deep enough into one's own experience. To do this, one needs to remove oneself from all the noise and input of one's normal world. Retreating from the world enables one to experience one's own mind more fully. So we need to go away. We need to leave the world, physically leave it, to go on retreat. In the Pali Canon, we find repeatedly, as I've said before, a reference to the phrase, having gone to the wilderness, to the shade of a tree, or to an empty building. Going to the forest or the mountain is the best condition for entering dhyana, or something more. Now this is a little bit of an aside actually, many of our Triratna retreats, in fact, probably pretty much all of our Triratna retreats, have a particular theme. But I'd like to promote the idea that going on retreat simply means leaving one's world behind for a while to experience oneself more deeply, to enter the world of the mind. It's a deeply fascinating world. Now, many people find their most positive experiences on retreat. Sometimes it's, I didn't finish that off, did I? So just go on retreat, not for any particular reason, but just to get away from the world. It's almost like you go on retreat expecting nothing, with nothing on offer. You just go there. You let the things go and guarantee stuff comes up. A lot of it very positive. Many people find their most positive experiences on retreat. Sometimes it's actually hard to say what it is because we tend to describe our experiences through objects, don't we? You know, sort of, I really liked that ice cream, or I thought she was lovely, or something like that. But on retreat, it's like there was just contentment, just happiness, just energy. It's hard to say what it is that's positive about one's retreat. But that experience can and should be the basis of a lot of developments and transformations within one's own life. It's also interesting to note that all of the major transformations in our movement have occurred because a number of people have been on retreat together. You know, back in the early days, we decided to get a centre after a retreat. We decided to start communities after being on retreat together. We decided to start right livelihood businesses after being on retreat together. So all of these things came out of the experience on retreat. So retreats, day, weekend, weeks, months, years, solitary, or with a small community, in my opinion, provide the most effective opportunity to practice renunciation and to experience the delightful results of those practices. So what are they? What are the delightful results? At one time, some Jain ascetics were trying to make a point to the Buddha about asceticism. They said that King Bimbisara lived in greater pleasure than the Buddha. The Buddha replied that was a false assumption. He was happier than his friend the king because he could sit quietly in great pleasure for as long as he wanted. Whereas King Bimbisara needed the external supports of palaces, dancing girls, fine food, and the love of his courtiers, and so on. Point made. One of the greatest, for me, the greatest sort of result of renunciation is freedom. Freedom in the Buddhist tradition is normally expressed in terms of liberation from the ashvaras. In other words, the desire for sensuous experience, attachment to sensuous experience, attachment to the higher levels of experience of the rupa and arupa loka, and belief in a permanently existing self. But for many of us, those are just words. Doesn't really convey all that much. Doesn't really convey what true liberation is. Now, this is the special province of the Vajrayana. The Vajrayana, not so concerned about doctrine, not so concerned about cognitive understanding, not at all concerned about it, actually. But what it tries to do is give one a taste of what that experience is. So Manjuvajra, reflection on Manjuvajra, will give one a taste of what it's like to be liberated cognitively. You know, he represents that cognitive release. Avalokiteshvara and Tara, of course, represent, express, embody liberation through compassion, through love. So meeting Tara or meeting Avalokiteshvara is equivalent to liberation, because you're meeting the love, the compassion of those bodhisattvas. Vajrapani, of course, communicates the confidence of being rooted in reality. Contact with Vajrapani through one sadhana brings you in contact with insight in the form of deeply seated confidence. And for freedom, who's the bodhisattva who communicates freedom? Well, it's Milarepa's Yidam, which is Vajrayogini. Vajrayogini is who we will meet and engage with in our pursuit of freedom. Now that's quite exciting. I find it quite exciting. Each of us has a Dakini. It's a bit like, his dark materials, They've got those little animals. Each of you has got a Dakini lurking in your being. And she is total renunciation, total freedom. So let's finish up just with a little reflection on the Dakini as a communication in a way of both renunciation and the freedom that comes from it. The Dakini appears in the cremation ground. Now, the cremation ground, of course, is the place of ultimate renunciation. It's where you go to be burned, where you go for the end of your life, where your body is finally totally renounced, and you let go of existence. So she appears at the time of death and dissolution, either actual or spiritual. She wears signs of death as her ornamentation. She loves it. She loves death. She loves dissolution. She wears skulls and bones. She's proud of them. They enhance her attraction. She carries a chopper to cut off any of those last bonds and connections and fetters, just to sort of, get rid of them. Come on, get rid of them. Come live with me, as it were. So she's scary. She is fearsome. One shouldn't really think about Vajrayogini without being a little bit terrified. So is freedom. Freedom is terrifying as well. If just walk out of your house one day without anything, no credit card, no nothing, and just walk away. It's a terrifying thought even that one might have to do that. But she is freedom, and she's completely free. She's transcendental. Vajrayogini is a transcendental Dakini, not a kind of one of the lesser Dakinis. She's completely free. She's completely naked. There's nothing to hide her emotional completeness. She's full-blooded. She's red. She's full of energy. She's full of vitality. She cares about nothing. She's wild. She's unbounded. She's free from social constraints, free from social business. She doesn't have an agenda. She's free from the world. She's totally free from all of that. All gone. She dances her freedom in the infinite blue sky. That's where she exists. So the Dakini is never a human woman. The Dakini is the reward of renunciation, the absolute reward, absolute freedom. And as Padmasambhava and others promise, she will appear. If one practices in the cremation ground, if one practices renunciation, then she will appear.